If you're curious to hear a little music from our guest Carla Lucero, who we spoke to in our most recent episode, check out E4TT's annual concert of music by women and non-binary composers, Midnight Serenades, on January 25th. Welcome to For Good Measure, an interview series celebrating diverse composers and other creative artists, sponsored by a grant from the California Arts Council. I'm Nanette McGuinness, Artistic Executive Director of Ensemble for these times. In this week's episode, we continue our conversation with Nina Shekhar, who we spoke to in December 2023. You talk about, you had some downtime for the first time in a while. For me, I find those times are rare and precious, but also really important for creativity. That, when you're constantly focused on driving forward to whatever deadline you're working on, it works. But the really interesting stuff happens when there's some blank time.
Definitely. I keep thinking back, a few years ago. It's funny, with the pandemic, a lot of people found some downtime, but for me, my workload picked up during the pandemic and I was extremely busy. And then right after 2020, like the year 2021 was the busiest year I've ever had. And it was probably I think I must have written 14 pieces that year.
Oh my
And it was
goodness.
including some a 20-minute orchestra piece, including some very large works. And I was so burnt out after that. And it just kind of, I was proud of what I had written, but it's like you lose some joy, when you don't have that time to recharge, that time to experiment also, when you constantly have deadline after deadline. It's like crunch time. You just churn out what you know is going to work without getting that time to learn and grow and experiment and just try new things. And I think since then, I've kind of taken the time to rearrange my schedule in the sense where, I still am quite busy, but I like to give myself some space, or at least try to fit in some passion projects of mine, things that I want to do for me, or things for me, time for me to just try different kinds of things, and that I wouldn't otherwise do if it was for a back-to-back commission. And so that's been really important to me because it helps me replenish that sense of joy, that sense of why is it that I'm doing what we do? And it's if we think about the arts, it's if it's not making us happy, it's why would we do it? That's the whole point. It makes us happy, it makes other people happy, and in a different way than being a doctor or being an engineer. When I could have done something else that would have been maybe a much more financially lucrative path or something like that, but it wouldn't have brought me the same joy. And that's why I chose to be in this field. So I'm trying to make sure I preserve that, and I'm very protective now of my time and how I schedule things, because I want to make sure I preserve that sense of excitement over what I do.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What did you do when you were feeling burned out at the end of 2021 to bring that joy back, other than looking at your schedule and going, Houston, there's a problem. We are making an adjustment here.
Yeah, I just took a lot of time off. I think I was lucky in that a lot of organizations were really understanding, because they were also kind of reeling still from the pandemic. And so there was the strange liminal kind of thing where suddenly some projects we were wait, are those still happening? It was kind of confusing, just because so many things had changed and a lot of these projects had been thought about before the pandemic, and then it's suddenly circumstances changed for everybody that they just weren't possible anymore. So that helped. So I was able to kind of clear out some space, but then I also just wanted more time to do other things, to cook, to go outside on walks, to try other hobbies, things like that. Give myself the space to, I had this era that I was trying to do a lot more writing and writing poetry and things like that. And and maybe also doing more like songwriting, like things that were kind of different than my otherwise like concert music practice. And that really helped me, just kind of think in a different way when I think about artistry and making things. And I think suddenly when I was seeing that art making could be approached from many different angles, I think it just made me feel excited that like, oh, this is something new I can try. This is something that like I always want to just constantly be learning and like trying new things. And um like if I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, then it sometimes doesn't feel that way. So I realize I need to have that instinct, like being able to have that moment of like, I want to do something new with everything I do and learn something in that process.
Yeah, be a human being. And also, when you're a polymath, which you are, and I am, and so I get this, if you're not constantly learning and evolving, it really does stifle the joy. And part of what keeps us fresh and alive is new and exciting toys to take out of the toy chest, and look at them different ways. And before the pandemic, you were building your career, and then all of a sudden, there it was. It's an interesting moment. What do you do now?
Exactly. It's like an interesting, like the shiny, I'm always trying to find the new shiny thing that I can work on. And I I guess actually a big thing that I did around that time was I started doing a lot more multimedia work and started doing a lot more video work, and that was something I had never done before. So it was like a new thing I could learn, a new way of exploring like with a visual language rather than a musical language, which was very new to me. So, and I think because, in any practice, like in our field, it's like we've learned all these rules that are not necessarily actual rules, but we think we have to follow them. And so like musically and like all these conventions that I have to follow musically, but then I don't know what the conventions are in the video world. Like I don't know what kinds of aesthetic practices. Like for me, it's just fun to make different things. So I think that was another way I was finding a lot of joy, is because for me it just felt like play. Like I could just try different things without worrying about like, oh, does this fit in with this aesthetic camp, or like does this follow this rule or something like that. And that's something I think also was important to me during that time.
Yeah, yeah, the joy in play, as it were. That's so nice. I love the way you describe yourself in your bio. I've read this description in another place as a composer who explores the intersection of identity, vulnerability, love, and laughter to create bold and intensely personal works. So it's just so cool. And it fits pretty nicely with what you were just describing as well. Can you talk about that, your practice, how you came up with that description, all that?
You know, I feel like all of those things in that statement, all those adjectives are very much related to my practice. I mean, as I mentioned, the identity is really important to me as an artist, and that kind of came from, for lack of a better word, I had like an identity crisis in like towards the end of my undergrad. And I think that around that time, there was just like a lot of things happening socially. I think it was like post Me Too. It was like I was kind of struggling a little bit just in terms of racial identity and finding a community. And I think because of that, like I was really in, I around that time I had done a piece related to obsessive compulsive disorder, which I have, and kind of being open about that. And I realized that I was starting on this direction to make very vulnerable work, and really thinking about myself as a person and my voice being represented in what I do. And this identity crisis I had, I think I felt like all these people were expecting my music to sound a certain way based off of what they thought it should sound like. Like I think a lot of people knew that I was Indian American and they thought my music should sound more Indian in whatever they thought that meant, or like they thought it wasn't Indian enough or was too Indian. It was like very confusing to me. And it's usually always people who were not Indian themselves making these claims. So for me, it was like, well, how do I sound like me in my music? And then I realized like my core value nowadays, which is that all art is rooted in identity. Like anybody, our identities are going to inform what we make and all of our decisions. And that'll in turn inform our creative practice. And for me, an identity in a really holistic sense, right? It's beyond my racial identity or the fact that I'm a woman. It's also like, my family. It's like my neighborhood I grew up in, like where I went to school. Like all of these things are, of course, going to inform what I do. And then kind of thinking about that from in another sense of like, what is my identity relationship with a performer's identity, or an audience member, and kind of expanding on this idea of identity. So that was like a big crucial thing, and that's why it's like the first thing that's said in my bio. And I mentioned like vulnerability. Like I started writing these very vulnerable pieces, and I think I kind of thought slowly kind of explore that idea of vulnerability differently over time, and sharing things about myself, but also making sure I protect myself and what I feel comfortable with in the process. But then this idea of love and laughter, ultimately I think it's like I want a space of empathy, with anybody who's going to be receiving my work, and to kind of have this communal space. And I mentioned that the piece I wrote about obsessive compulsive disorder. With that, I had a lot of really nice discussions with audience members or who wrote to me and said, oh, they had similar experiences or they could relate to it in certain ways, which I thought was really special to me. And laughter also is just like, I don't know, I don't take myself very seriously. I'm like always kind of just joking around, and I like to find elements of humor, even like that piece I'm talking about. Like a lot of things are quite funny in the piece if you don't know what it's about, and that's like the whole point. And I see that, like I find humor in a lot of situations, so that's really important to me. And all of these ideas, even the word intersection, like intersectionality is all about like this idea of multiple identities overlapping, and for me, like intersectionality was a really important concept, just as a woman of color, and kind of wanting to understand the specific challenges related to that. So I feel like all of those words are like very specifically chosen, and it's like I haven't really had to dissect that before, but it's definitely like every word is meant to represent something different about my artistry.
No, yeah, it's great because it is precise and detailed and wonderful. That's why I wanted to ask you about that. The whole reductionist notion to a human being is fraught with problems. That's all I can say.
Definitely.
We are more than the sum of our parts. So
exactly. Very
yeah.
true.
Thank you for listening to For Good Measure, and a special thank you to our guest, Nina Shekhar, for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast by clicking on the subscribe button, and support us by sharing it with your friends, posting about it on social media, and leaving us a rating and a review. To learn more about E4TT, our concert season online and in the Bay Area, or to make a tax-deductible donation, please visit us at e4tt.org. This podcast is made possible in part by a grant from the California Arts Council and generous donors like you. For Good Measure is produced by Nanette McGuinness and Ensemble for These Times and designed by Brennan Stokes, with special thanks to co-producer and audio engineer Stephanie M. Neumann. Remember to keep supporting equity in the arts and tune in next week for Good Measure.